The movement of this antithesis is, in the first instance, the formal production of an identity of what the evil consciousness is in its own self and what it declares itself to be. It must be made apparent that it is evil, and thus its existence made to correspond to its essence. The hypocrisy must be unmasked. This return of the disparity present in his hypocrisy into a correspondence is not already an accomplished fact, because hypocrisy, as is commonly said, demonstrates its respect for duty and virtue just by making a show of them and using them as a mask to hide itself from its own consciousness, no less than from others. As if in this acknowledgement of the antithesis within itself, identity and correspondence were implied. Only it is, at the same time, just as much reflected out of this spoken acknowledgement and into itself, and the fact that it uses what is an essence as a being for another implies rather its own contempt for that essence and the exposure to everyone of its own lack of any substantial being. For what lets itself be used as an external instrument shows itself to be a thing which possesses no importance of its own. In paragraph 661, we see the side of the universal, the side of others, the consciousness that is not that of conscience, but rather that motivated by duty, attempting to impose, or you might even say squeeze, the hypocritical consciousness into an admission of its hypocrisy and therefore a endorsement, an embrace of its evil, perhaps so that it will realize how it's gotten things wrong and then, knuckle under and conform to the universal, to this realm of mutual acknowledgement in language, in the community. And instead what we get is an escape or perhaps even a resistance on the part of the consciousness that has now been labeled as evil, that is maintaining this distinction within itself, that is acting according to its own rule or impetus or its own view on the situation, what we call its conscience, its Gewissen, its certainty of itself, Gewissheit, right? So how does this actually play out? Well, we could frame it in terms of, if we want to be facetious again, the universal strikes back, but its blow is actually not as effective as it seems. So he begins by saying the movement of this antithesis, this opposition, right, Gegensatz, is in the first instance the formal production of an identity of what the evil consciousness is in its own self and what it declares itself to be. It must be made apparent that it is evil. And so made apparent by whom, for whom? Well, this is an assertion or the reflection of a desire on the part of, ostensibly the universal, the Allgemeine, right? Which is the community itself and the members of the community, the consciousnesses that are motivated by what they take to be duty rather than acknowledging the extrinsic or eccentric decision of consciousness on the part of what is being labeled now as the evil consciousness. And it actually could be an evil consciousness. It could be evil in a number of different respects, or it could just be being labeled as evil. I was, thinking as I was reading through this again about that scene in The Sound of Music where you have that song, right? How do you solve a problem like Maria? Maria, later to become Maria von Trapp, right? I forget what her original name is a nun or actually maybe not even a nun, a postulant rather, in an order of nuns, and she's rather free-spirited, and it's not as if she's completely random. She does things with a purpose, a Zweck, right? For example, when she winds up in the household and the children need new clothes, she takes the curtains and turns them into outfits, right? And so that's sort of a going against the order, but there's always a justification. Why is she out there spinning around at the beginning on the grassy plains in the Alps? Well, she's celebrating nature or something like that, right? There's something motivating that conscience, that consciousness. And so, there's this attempt to impose this identity. Identity is Gleichheit here. So this is referring back to the Ungleichheit, what's being translated as disparity here. We could say equality and inequality, or even commensurability and incommensurability as well. Although it's not exactly the same. That's why I chose to represent this with a sort of equal sign with a question mark superimposed over it. There's a conflict there. And merely asserting something to be an identity, merely asserting something to have been equalized, is not the same thing as it truly being so. So what is being equalized here? Let's look at that first. So he says that the formal production of an identity of what the evil consciousness is in its own self and what it declares itself to be. So a little bit later, he's going to talk about essence and existence. And Miller, by the way, is going to equate, or rather in his translation choice a little bit later in the paragraph, is going to use the word essence in place of the an sich, and that's perfectly fine, right? Because it is what it is in itself, the essence of the thing. So and we'll get to the Das Böse in just a moment. Let's just go along. The evil consciousness here, all right, what it is in its own self. We saw that there's this disjunction between the universal, the in itself, and what it expresses, ausspricht. This is interesting here that it's ausspricht, because this is a general term, aussprechen, for expressing, but it also has that linguistic element to it, which is going to show up a little bit later here in the paragraph in Sprache, right? Sprache, Rede, communication, discourse, language, is the medium in which the universal is manifesting itself at this point, what allows there to be a community of recognition. So what it is expressing is taking place both in the medium of action and also, in the medium of some sort of expression. It could be in words, it could be in attitudes, right? Because we're talking about hypocrisy. We've got this rich language here of taking the mask off. Actions themselves are expressive. So what this is expressing is its Dasein, its existence. And here we have, an interesting invocation on Hegel's part of something that he doesn't often, engage in here in the Phenomenology, this age-old discussion of the difference between essence and existence, right? And the being of a person, encompassing both of these. This goes far, far back into medieval philosophy, where it plays a major role, and even ancient philosophy as well. The difference between existence and essence. Also we might say between accident and substance. Now, in this case, however, what's being expressed is really we might call it the other essence. I'm showing what my essence is. I'm determining what I am in my existence. Again, I've pointed this out before. People often take the existentialists as, going against a Hegel of essentialism. And this is a prime example where there's a good bit of existentialism already there in Hegel, at least in some of the shapes of consciousness. So we've got these two sides to things. Are they actually being equated? And we should think about what it means to be equated. If this is indeed sort of an evil, hypocritical existence, then we could say, well, the Gleichung, the equation, the leveling things out should make this no longer bad but good, right? The universal should take priority over it. But we might also say, no, this is showing itself as essentially evil, and we want them to express that rather than saying that they're doing something different. We want them to label themselves the way that we're labeling them. I mentioned I would come back to this idea of das Böse. So what is Böse? It's evil, right? And this das here is being translated, you could say, referentially back to the consciousness, right? So here we go. What the evil consciousness is in its own self. Hegel doesn't actually say das böse Bewusstsein or anything like that, or conscience would be closer because Gewissen can be das, can be neutral, right? It's okay to read that in, but I think it's also a little bit more rich if we think about this. This is also defining what is evil. What is das Böse? What is the evil? What is evilness? So I think that there's something kind of interesting and ambiguous going on there. Now, does this unmasking of hypocrisy work the way the universal wants it to? No, it does not at all. That sort of resolution or reconciliation is offered but not achieved. So he goes on and he says, this return of the disparity present in hypocrisy in a correspondence is not already an accomplished fact. Why? Because hypocrisy demonstrates its respect for duty and virtue just by making a show of them. So hypocrisy puts on a mask, an appearance of duty and virtue. And it does so for, if you're a genuine hypocrite, I suppose you could say there's two kinds of hypocrites, right? There's the hypocrites who are just about trying to deceive others, right? It's engaging in dissimulation, to go back to the previous section before all of this stuff here. Dissimulation, right? And it's done to deceive others. It's done to pretend to be virtuous, to be fulfilling duty, to be fitting in, to be one of the community. But it's also often done to fool oneself. And in some respects, successful hypocrites, part of what damages them as hypocrites is the fact that they do deceive themselves. And there's this disjunction within them between, you might say, the essence that's being expressed in the sense of the mask that's being put on, and their genuine existence, which is to be, doing their own thing, whatever that happens to be. And doing your own thing could be like breaking the rules so as to preserve a person's life or show compassion or to, create artistic masterpieces. It could also be to make yourself rich or to impose suffering on others. We're not. There are going to be some actually, bad actors in this. He's not specifying what it is here. So he goes on and he says, it demonstrates its respect for duty and virtue just by making a show of them, using them as a mask to hide itself from its own consciousness, no less than from others. As if in this acknowledgement, anerkennen, of the antithesis within itself, identity and correspondence were implied. Then Hegel uses this language that we've remarked on in the last several paragraphs, this language of reflection. Reflection now being clarified. Before it was reflection out of the universal into itself, right? And we still have the into itself part here. But now what is the reflection? The reflection is out of the spoken acknowledgement. That's how Miller is translating it. Anerkennen der Sprache. So out of the acknowledgement, the recognition Again, very important term, right? We're seeking recognition as self-consciousness from other self-consciousnesses. We got it before in this notion of duty shared across a community through the medium of language. So, Anerkennen der Sprache, the recognition. Well, if we want to play around with this a little bit, yes, it could be spoken acknowledgement, the recognition or acknowledgement of language, meaning carried out by the medium of language. It could also mean the recognition granted by the language, granted by there being something bigger than all of us that we're caught up within, a language that is already, you could say, moralized. And so I'm going to go on a little bit of a digression here. People often, especially if they're coming at language from a, you might say, post-Humean sort of point of view, with, there's a radical disjunction between is and ought, and you can never get an ought from an is. They don't realize that the technically correct analytic position that they're taking doesn't map on to the reality of language as it's been used by human beings, basically, as far as we can tell from its earliest historical attestations, the literature that we have. Language is always carrying, but only imperfectly so, moral norms. Language provides a space in which morality can be imposed, developed further, applied, contested, brought into contradiction with itself, imperfectly expressed. That is part of the nature of communication. So, I think there's something a bit bigger going on here than just language being the medium, in this case, of recognition, right? So he says, it is at the same time just as much reflected out of this spoken acknowledgement and into itself, and the fact that it uses what is an essence. Okay, so what is the essence? Here I mentioned, the word isn't actually Wesen, it's an sich. But we could translate that as the essence, right? The essence that's supposed to be in this formal production of identity, which is not actually taking. And it uses that essence, the essence of morality, the essence of the moral norms coming from the universal. It's using that as a tool. It uses it as a being for another, right? In order to get some sort of acknowledgement or at least, response from the other. And he says it implies rather its own contempt for that essence and the exposure to everyone of its own lack of any substantial being. What is lacking substantial being? Not the acting consciousness, not the evil, but rather the universal, the essence. And he says, what lets itself be used in an external instrument shows itself to be a thing, ding, right, which possesses no importance, schwer, of its own. What lets itself be used as an external instrument, a Zeug, something that can just be moved around. So the fact that anybody can talk about duty, the fact that anybody could be a hypocrite, means in a certain way that anybody could be a hypocrite. And all this clever talk or imposing talk of duty and virtue may not be what it is actually pretended to be. There's no real substance there at this point. Also, this identity is not brought about either by the one-sided persistence of the evil consciousness in its own attitude or by the judgment of the universal consciousness. If the former denies itself in the face of the consciousness of duty and declares that what this asserts to be wickedness to be absolutely non-identical with the universal is an action in accordance with inner law and conscience, then in this one-sided assurance of an identity, there still remains its non-identity with the other, since this other does not believe it or acknowledge it. In other words, since the one-sided persistence in one extreme cancels itself out, evil would, it is true, thereby confess to being evil. But in so doing, it would directly abolish itself and cease to be hypocrisy, and would not, as such, unmask itself. It admits, in fact, to being evil by asserting that it acts in opposition to the acknowledged universal according to its own inner law and conscience. For if this law and conscience were not the law of its single individuality and caprice, it would not be something inner or peculiar to it, but what is universally acknowledged. Therefore, whenever anyone says that he is acting according to his own law and conscience against others, he is saying, in fact, that he is wronging them. But actual conscience is not this persistence in a knowing and willing that opposes itself to the universal. On the contrary, the universal is the element of its existence, and its language declares its action to be an acknowledged duty. In paragraph 662, Hegel is continuing to examine the stance of the labeled as evil consciousness, the one who is appealing to individual conscience against the universal and is being labeled as such by the rest of the community, speaking on behalf of the universal. And there's this attempt to impose a identity, let's try one more time. In paragraph 662, Hegel continues examining this problematic of the attempt to impose a kind of identity, an identity of existence and essence, an identity between the evil consciousness, the one that's following its own conscience, against the universal, with its fragmented or discordant self, and also with the perspective of the universal. This is rather a tall order, you might say. And he says, listen, this just is not going to happen at this point. He says, this identity is not brought about, and he says it's not brought about by either of these two things. What are they? The judgment of the universal consciousness, the Urteil, the decision, the passing judgment upon it. That's not going to work. And he doesn't really talk that much about that, except insofar as we're talking about the non-identity, what it is that conscience makes of the universal, the stance of the universal. So that's not going to be particularly helpful. And there's no agency coming there, although we'll see that emerge in the next paragraph. Or the one-sided persistence of the evil consciousness in its own attitude. Now, the in its own attitude is a little bit being read in there on the part of Miller in the way that it's doing things, right? But one-sided, whenever we see Hegel using this term einseitige, one-sided, we know that there's a problem. We know that something is being left out that is going to have to be supplied. So, we're going to arrive ultimately at the end of this paragraph in a sort of impasse, or if you like the fancy Greek term for it that people use these days, aporia, right? And then we'll have to move beyond that. We're not going to have a resolution here. Although, interestingly, we do have an Aufhebung, right? We do have what people like to translate as sublation. In this case, though, the Aufhebung is actually going to be more destructive than productive. So he says that why aren't we going to have this identity being brought about? So we have to look at why we actually have a non-identity going on here. It says, if the former, that is the evil consciousness, denies itself in face of the consciousness of duty and declares that what this asserts to be wickedness, to be absolutely non-identical with the universal, is an action in accordance with inner law and conscience, then, and we'll go on from there, but let's run over that first. So, if the evil consciousness both takes in but rejects the point of view of the universal does have a point of view. What does that point of view consist in? It's calling what the evil consciousness is doing wickedness, or we could say, to bring up a term that was used earlier in the culture section, baseness, being wrong, being bad. And this is a particular form of evil, right? But it's like, well, why are you doing this? Why can't you fit in? Why can't you be a good boy or a good girl and make yourself part of this community? It rejects the evil conscious as as being non-identical with the universal, not fitting in, being against duty and virtue, to use the terms that we were looking at last paragraph, what it is that hypocrisy is pretending to. And here's something even more important. It does not believe or acknowledge. It doesn't provide recognition to, it doesn't provide any ratification to the evil consciousness. It views it as sort of, a cog in the machine that's been replaced by, something that it shouldn't be, a rock or some jelly or whatever you want. It doesn't really understand it, and it doesn't want to understand it. It wants the individual rather to, as we say, get with the program. So he goes on and he says, what this asserts to be wickedness, be non-identical with the universal, is an action in accordance with, now this is how the evil consciousness is appealing to itself and justifying itself, to an inner law and conscience. So this is important. Conscience, we've been talking about this the entire time, right? It is a certainty of itself, but now he's invoking an inner law, an inner norm, right? There's a norm that's opposed to the other norm. We've seen this play itself out before in earlier dialectics, have we not? So in this case, it's the individual who is acting in accordance with a law which they provide to themselves from where? Well, we're going to get to that in a moment. So he says, here we go. In this one-sided assurance, notice that one-sided again, of an identity, there still remains its non-identity with the other. What is the other? The universal. It's also the concrete other, the other who is motivated by duty and saying, man, you're a hypocrite. You're just trying to do your own thing, and you're putting on an appearance, a face, a justification that doesn't really match who you are. You're doing something that you want to do, but it doesn't map onto what we all acknowledge as what we ought to do. You're a fraud. Right? So that's another concrete consciousness, another self-consciousness in relation to this one. And it's got the universal on its side. So like he says, this other does not believe or acknowledge it. And in other words, since the one-sided persistence in one extreme cancels itself out, and there's the Aufhebung, right? He says, evil would directly or thereby confess to being evil. Now this word confess, right? Eingestehen. It's a little bit broader than like a directly juridical, confessional sort of thing. Or the thing where we go, I've been hiding this secret from you. I have to confess, blah, 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 blah. It can also mean to vouch for or to acknowledge, but in a different sense than anerkennen, right? Anerkennen is about, knowing the other in a certain way. Recognizing. This is saying, I'm evil, I'm bad, I'm, base, according to what you say, according to society's standards, right? If we want to get a little facetious with that, and if we wanted to invoke the dude, right? But that's just your opinion, man, right? I've got my own opinion inside of me, and that's what really matters to me. So this abolishing itself, this development is not something that's totally wiping itself out, but it does abolish itself and cease to be hypocrisy. And because it's not hypocrisy at that point, because it's being open, it can't unmask itself. You could say, well, it just did unmask itself. No, it unmasked itself as evil. It didn't unmask itself as hypocrisy. There's sort of a double development here, right? So the universal wants the individual to say, you're a hypocrite, man. Admit not just that you're hiding something, but also that you're a hypocrite. Can't happen, right? Because now it's unmasked itself and said, I'm running my own show. I'm going along with my own law. How does it admit to being evil? It doesn't say, oh man, you're totally right. Whatever you've said about me, let me sign the document and confess. It's admitting to be evil by the very virtue that it's acting in accordance with its inner law and conscience. Why is this a problem? He says that if this law and conscience were not the law of its single individuality and caprice, we'll come back to that, it would not be something inner or peculiar to it, but what is universally acknowledged. Now, we should pause there for a second. There's two ways in which it could be something universally acknowledged. It could be that it actually does take on the point of view of the universal, in which case what it's doing would be just contradictory. Maybe it misapplies the law or something like that. Or it could be invoking an alternate universal and saying, I am following this, and all sorts of other people agree with me. Many people think, right? In which case it would betray itself. It would no longer be staking its own claim according to its own inner law, right? It would not be coming from its individuality. It would be just as conformist. I mean, think about all these people. We joke about hipsters, and they're wanting to drink Pabst Blue Ribbon, which, by the way, is a crappy beer. There's good reasons why it basically went out of business before the hipsters rediscovered it and then started drinking it and making a thing out of it. People didn't want to drink it here where it came from because it wasn't particularly good, right? And it became an emblem for them, a way of showing how nonconformist they were. This is admittedly a really trivial example, but I think consumerism provides us with all sorts of great instances of this. So they're going against the universal. And what would the universal be? Only drink stuff that's actually worth drinking. And instead they all are nonconformists, but they're all nonconformists together. Just like the hippies, right? Back in the 60s. Oh man, we're all doing our own thing. We're all wearing the same tie-dye stuff and having the same patchouli oil and having the same kind of signs. I'm being a bit facetious here because of course there was a lot of nonconformism and there was a lot of spontaneity, but there also was a lot of sort of what we could call here not buying into this universal, but buying into a different universal and claiming that you're doing your own thing that way, following your own inner law, when you're not really following your own inner law, you're following somebody else's inner law. So, I mean, that's not here in the text, but it's definitely something we could read in. So, if this law and conscience were not the law of its single individuality and caprice, it would not be something inner or peculiar to it. Now, individuality, Einzelheit, something we've been exploring a lot through this section, right? Caprice, Willkür, right? Now that is a term which can also mean arbitrariness, having one's own willfulness going on there. And so there's a bit of a worry here. Where is this really coming from? Is it just whim? Another way we could translate it. So he says, therefore, when anyone says he's acting in accordance to his own law and conscience against others, against what the universal is saying we ought to do, he is saying, in fact, that he's wronging them. He's doing wrong to them. That's why this is viewed as evil. But, and here's where we get to the impasse, actual willkürlich conscience, Gewissen, is not this persistence in a knowing and willing that opposes itself to the universal. It's not just doing it to oppose itself to the universal. It happens to oppose itself to this universal. On the contrary, the universal is the element of its existence, and its language declares its action to be an acknowledged duty. So it's got to find some way, and this is where we're at an impasse, right? Actual consciousness, wirklich Gewissen, right, has to find some way to reincorporate the universal into itself. So it's not just individuality and arbitrariness or caprice. It's got to find some way to make of itself something that can recuperate the universal, we might say. That's not happening here at this point. Hegel's just asserting that, but it's not being developed as that. And now we're going to move on to yet another side of this problem.